Shaq walked into an auto shop for a simple repair, but what he saw made his blood boil. A desperate father begged for a fair price, but the mechanic just laughed. No cash, no fix. The little boy clutched his dad's hand, tears in his eyes. Shaq knew a scam when he saw one, but instead of arguing, he pulled out his phone, because he had a plan. What happened next destroyed the mechanic's business, exposed a massive fraud, and changed the town forever. Stay till the end, because this story is unbelievable. Wait, before we go any further, I gotta ask, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. Shaq stepped into the dimly lit Grayson Auto Repair. The scent of motor oil and burnt rubber thickened the air. The place was cluttered, old tires stacked against the walls, half-assembled engines resting on workbenches, and a flickering fluorescent light buzzing overhead. It was the kind of shop that had seen better days. But what caught Shaq's attention wasn't the mess. It was the conversation unfolding at the front counter. A man in his mid-30s, wearing a grease-stained shirt and faded jeans, stood gripping his wallet tightly. His posture was tense, shoulders hunched as if carrying the weight of the world. Beside him, a small boy, no older than 7, clung to his father's leg, his wide eyes darting between the adults. I just need the alternator replaced, the father pleaded, his voice tight with exhaustion. I can cover the cost of the part, but the labor fees, please man, I can't afford those extra charges. Tony, the head mechanic, leaned against the counter, smirking as he wiped his hands on a rag. His uniform was cleaner than the other workers, a clear sign that he preferred handling money over getting his hands dirty. He exhaled dramatically, shaking his head. That's the price, buddy, Tony said, shrugging. No cash, no fix. The father's face fell. He glanced down at his son, who tugged on his sleeve. Daddy, does that mean we can't go to Grandma's? The boy asked softly. Shaq clenched his jaw, his fingers curling into fists at his sides. He had seen this scam too many times. Dishonest mechanics preying on people who had no choice but to pay whatever outrageous fee they were given. The father swallowed hard and reached into his pocket, pulling out a handful of crumpled bills. He counted them, his hands shaking. It wasn't enough. Look, man, the father said, voice cracking. I just need to get my son home. Tony chuckled, tapping the register with his fingers. Then I suggest you figure something out, or take your busted car somewhere else. Shaq had heard enough. He stepped forward, his towering frame casting a long shadow over the counter. How much is it? Shaq asked, his voice deep and firm. Tony barely glanced at him. You got a car in here too, big guy? His tone was dismissive, uninterested. He had no idea who he was talking to. Shaq ignored the question. How much is the repair? Tony rolled his eyes, punching numbers into the register. For the alternator, $400, plus labor fees, diagnostics, and shop costs, that's $650. Shaq's brows furrowed. That was at least twice the standard rate. The father's shoulders slumped. He reached for his son's hand, nodding in defeat. Come on, buddy, he said quietly. We'll figure something else out. Shaq didn't move. I'll cover it. The father's eyes widened. Sir, I can't ask you to do that. You're not asking, Shaq said. I'm offering. Tony scoffed, leaning on the counter. Oh, now we got a hero? He smirked, crossing his arms. Look, man, I don't know how business works where you're from, but this ain't charity. Shaq's gaze darkened. Business should be fair. He gestured toward the father and son. And this? This ain't fair, Tony snorted. Fair don't pay the bills, big guy. He grabbed the credit card machine. You paying or not? Shaq pulled out his card and handed it over. I'm paying, he said, and I want a receipt. Tony grinned as he swiped the card. The machine beeped, printing out a receipt. He ripped it off and slid it across the counter with a smug expression. Shaq picked it up and frowned. Something wasn't right. Extra charges were tacked onto the bill. Brake fluid replacement, engine flush, alignment service. None of those were necessary for an alternator replacement. He looked up, locking eyes with Tony. Tony's smirk deepened. Problem, big guy? Shaq exhaled slowly, his grip on the receipt tightening. Yeah, there was a problem, and Tony had no idea who he was messing with. The dad exhaled sharply, his fingers trembling as he dug into his pockets, pulling out every last bill he had. He counted them quickly, his lips pressed together as if hoping more money would magically appear. But it was clear, he was far short of the total. His son looked up at him, his small fingers clutching his father's sleeve. Daddy, we can't go to Grandma's. His voice was barely above a whisper. The dad swallowed hard, blinking rapidly as if trying to hold back frustration, or maybe shame. We'll figure something out, buddy, he murmured, tucking the bills back into his wallet. Shaq had seen enough. He stepped forward, his presence alone enough to make the air in the room shift. How much is it? His deep voice cut through the tense silence like a blade. Both the dad and Tony looked up. The dad's eyes flickered with a mix of confusion and gratitude. Tony, on the other hand, barely acknowledged him, still leaning lazily on the counter, twirling a wrench in his fingers. You got a car in here too, big guy? Tony asked, his tone dismissive. Shaq's expression remained neutral, but his voice carried weight. No, he said simply, but I can cover the cost. He pulled out his credit card, holding it between his fingers. The dad's eyes widened. Sir, I can't ask you to do that. You're not asking, Shaq said. I'm offering. Tony scoffed, shaking his head as if this was the funniest thing he'd heard all day. Oh, now we got a hero? He leaned forward on the counter. Look, man, I don't know where you think you are, but this ain't some charity. Shaq tilted his head slightly, his gaze locked onto Tony's. You're right, he said, voice calm but firm. Business should be fair. He gestured toward the dad and his son. And this? This ain't fair. Tony rolled his eyes, tossing the wrench onto the counter. Fair don't pay the bills, he muttered, shaking his head. Then he smirked. You paying or not? Shaq studied him for a long moment, then slid his card across the counter. Oh, I'm paying, he said, and I want a receipt. Tony grabbed the card with a smirk, swiping it with an almost theatrical flourish. The register beeped, the receipt printer whirred, and Tony ripped the paper from the machine. He handed it to Shaq, flashing his teeth in a smug grin. Here you go, big spender. Shaq took the receipt, his eyes scanning the numbers. And then, he frowned. Something wasn't right. The total was higher than it should have been. Buried beneath the actual repair cost were additional charges. Brake fluid replacement, engine flush, diagnostic fees, and labor costs that made no sense for a simple alternator replacement. Shaq's fingers tightened around the paper. Tony's smirk grew wider. Problem, big guy? Shaq inhaled slowly. Yeah, there was a problem, and Tony had no idea what was coming next. Shaq's eyes scanned the receipt again, his brows furrowing as he noticed the numbers didn't add up. The alternator replacement was listed, but underneath it were a string of extra charges. Brake fluid replacement, an engine flush, unnecessary diagnostic fees, and inflated labor costs. Shaq lifted his gaze, locking eyes with Tony, who was still leaning on the counter with that smug grin. Brake fluid replacement? Shaq's voice was calm, controlled. Engine flush? He didn't ask for these. Tony shrugged, completely unfazed. Standard service, he said lazily. Part of the package. Shaq exhaled through his nose, nodding slightly. Really? Because I know a thing or two about cars. Tony scoffed, crossing his arms. Yeah? And I know how to run a shop. His smirk widened. That card went through. So we're done here. Shaq held his ground, rolling the receipt between his fingers. Then without a word, he pulled out his phone and started taking pictures of the receipt, the counter, and the shop's pricing board on the wall. Tony's smirk flickered, his arms dropping to his sides. Hey, what the hell are you doing? Shaq didn't even glance up. He turned toward the dad. You ever get a receipt like this before? The dad hesitated, glancing nervously at Tony before lowering his gaze. Every time I come here, he admitted, voice barely above a whisper. Shaq let out a slow breath, shaking his head. That's what I thought. Tony's jaw clenched. He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a warning tone. I don't know who you think you are, but you need to leave. Shaq finally looked at him, a small, knowing smile creeping onto his face. You'll find out soon enough. Tony's fingers curled into fists. He had scammed plenty of people before, but something told him this time. He might have messed with the wrong guy. Tony leaned against the counter, his smirk widening as he crossed his arms. Go ahead, big guy, he taunted. Call the cops. I'm not breaking any laws. Shaq chuckled, shaking his head as he dialed a number. Not the cops, he said coolly. Someone way worse for you. Tony's smirk faltered, but he kept up the act. Oh yeah? And who's that supposed to be? The call connected, and a voice on the other end boomed through the speaker. Hey, Shaq, what's up? Shaq's eyes never left Tony's. You still running that news segment on business fraud? There was a brief pause before the voice responded. Always. Got something for me? Shaq smirked. Oh yeah, I've got a real good one. Tony's posture stiffened. Wait, what? Shaq extended the phone toward the struggling father. Tell them everything. The dad hesitated, looking between Shaq and Tony. His fingers trembled slightly as he took the phone, lifting it to his ear. Uh, hi. My name's Daniel, and I... He swallowed hard, glancing at his son, who clutched his jacket. I've been coming to this shop for months. Every time I get hit with charges I don't understand. I don't know much about cars, so I thought it was normal, but I just paid over double what I was supposed to. The voice on the phone responded quickly. You have receipts? The dad nodded before realizing they couldn't see him. Yeah, I kept them all. Tony's face twisted with barely contained panic. Hold on now. Let's not get crazy. Shaq silenced him with a single look. The reporter's voice came back through the speaker, firm and certain. We're on our way. Tony's face drained of color. The last thing he wanted was cameras rolling into his shop. Tony's confidence had been slipping, but now it was completely gone. His fingers tapped against the counter, his eyes darting toward the front window as the news van pulled up. The door swung open, and out stepped a sharp-dressed reporter with a cameraman trailing behind her. She adjusted her mic, her gaze immediately locking onto Shaq. You the one who called us? She asked. Shaq nodded, jerking his chin toward Tony. I figured you'd want to see a scam in action. Tony let out a forced laugh. Oh, come on, man, he scoffed, wiping his hands on his oil-stained rag. This is ridiculous. You can't just show up here with cameras. The reporter didn't even look at him. Pretty sure we can, she said, brushing past Shaq and stepping forward. We've had complaints about this shop for months. She turned, tilting her mic toward Tony. Mind answering a few questions? Tony took a step back, holding up both hands. No comment. The cameraman zoomed in as Tony turned his back and started toward the office door. Shaq stepped in his path, crossing his arms. That's funny, he said, tilting his head. You were real loud a few minutes ago. What changed? Tony clenched his jaw, eyes flashing with barely contained rage. Behind them, the dad was still on the phone with the news station. He looked up, stunned. Hey, Shaq. They want to run the full story. Tony's whole body stiffened. His eyes darted toward the exit, calculating. He wasn't going down without a fight, and Shaq could tell. Tony was about to do something desperate. Tony's face twitched as he realized the walls were closing in. Cameras were rolling. His employees weren't backing him up, and Shaq wasn't going anywhere. His hands curled into fists, but he forced a grin, acting as if this was all just a misunderstanding. All right, that's enough, Tony snapped. You've had your fun. Now get out of my shop. The reporter didn't budge. Neither did Shaq. The young employee, the same one Tony had barked at earlier, glanced at the others. None of them moved. No one was on Tony's side. Tony's patience shattered. Shut it down! Kick them out! He roared, pointing at the door. A middle-aged mechanic, who had been working on a car in the back, wiped his greasy hands on a rag and muttered under his breath. This dude's lost it. Another employee hesitated. Boss, maybe we should just... Now! Tony's voice cracked with desperation. Shaq watched it all unfold, his arms still crossed. Tony wasn't just angry, he was scared. You're in real trouble, huh? Shaq mused, tilting his head. Tony spun on him, his face red. You don't know a damn thing about me. Shaq's expression didn't change. I know a scam when I see one. Tony scoffed. You think you're some kind of hero? A celebrity? Walks in, throws some money around, and suddenly, what? You're the town savior? Shaq didn't blink. No, he said simply. I just don't like seeing people get screwed over. Tony's lips curled into a smirk. This little show you're putting on? It won't last. People forget. A week from now, no one will care. The reporter stepped closer, raising an eyebrow. I wouldn't be so sure about that. Tony's smug expression flickered for just a second. He could feel the weight of the cameras, the customers still watching. He turned and pointed directly at the cameraman. You can't film here. This is my shop. I own this place. Shaq gave a small chuckle. For now. Tony's eyes darted back to him. What's that supposed to mean? Shaq didn't answer. Instead, he pulled out his phone and dialed a number. Tony's stomach dropped. Shaq's voice was calm, casual. Yeah, I need a lawyer. Now. Tony swallowed hard. Shaq leaned in slightly. You've been playing dirty for a long time, Tony. It's about time someone played back. Tony knew things had just gone from bad to disastrous. Tony's knuckles turned white as his fists clenched. His world was unraveling faster than he could grasp. And Shaq wasn't just exposing him. He was taking everything. "This is a joke," Tony hissed, his voice shaking with a mixture of rage and disbelief. "You're bluffing." Shaq simply leaned against the counter, his phone still pressed to his ear. "Yeah, I'll have my guy wire the payment today," he said casually, his eyes locked onto Tony's. "Oh, and tell the bank to process the ownership transfer as soon as possible. We don't want any delays." Tony's breathing grew uneven. His face was a mix of panic and fury. "You can't buy this place." His voice wavered. "I own it." Shaq tilted his head, amused. "No, you rent it," he corrected. "And the real owner?" He held up his phone. "He's selling." A tense silence filled the room. The employees behind the counter looked at each other, their expressions shifting from nervousness to something else. Hope. A nervous chuckle escaped the young cashier. "Wait, so you're really buying the shop?" Shaq shrugged. "Already did." Tony's face drained of all color. The news reporter's microphone was still hot, catching every single word. The cameraman zoomed in on Tony's expression, the perfect shot for the segment that was going to destroy his reputation. Tony stumbled back, gripping the edge of the counter like a man on the edge of a cliff. You can't just walk in here and take over." His voice cracked. "That's not how this works." Shaq exhaled, shaking his head. "Nah, see? That's exactly how it works when you play dirty." Tony's breathing quickened, his eyes darting between Shaq, the employees, the camera, the exit. He looked like a man caged in with no way out. Then in a split second, he snapped. "No!" Tony lunged forward, his hand swinging. Shaq saw it coming from a mile away. His reflexes kicked in. He sidestepped effortlessly. Tony's punch hit nothing but air. The momentum threw Tony off balance. He stumbled forward, his feet tangling. And then, crash! Tony slammed into a metal toolbox, sending wrenches, sockets, and screwdrivers flying across the floor. The employees gasped. The cameraman zoomed in. Shaq raised an eyebrow. "Now that was a wrong move." Tony groaned, pushing himself up. But he wasn't done yet. His eyes flickered to something on the workbench. Something dangerous. His fingers curled around the handle of a heavy steel wrench. Shaq's muscles tensed. The employees froze. The dad grabbed his son, pulling him behind a stack of tires. "Hey, let's go, let's go." His voice shook. The reporter took a cautious step back. The cameraman kept rolling. Tony's chest heaved with anger. His grip on the wrench tightened. His knuckles turned white. Shaq didn't move. His gaze locked onto Tony's, his expression unreadable. "Think about what you're doing," Shaq said, his voice unnervingly calm. Tony shook his head, teeth gritted. "You ruined everything!" His arm tensed. He was about to swing. Shaq sighed. "Don't do it." Tony swung. Shaq caught his wrist midair. A sharp gasp echoed through the room. Tony's face twisted in shock. His arm trembled as Shaq's grip turned to steel. "Bad decision," Shaq muttered. With one swift motion, he yanked the wrench from Tony's hand and tossed it across the shop. It clattered against the concrete floor. Tony's breath hitched. He tried to jerk his arm away, but Shaq didn't let go. "Let me go," Tony hissed, squirming in Shaq's grasp. Shaq leaned in. "You tried to rob people blind. Then when you got caught, you tried to swing on me?" His grip tightened slightly. "Tell me, Tony, who's the bully now?" Tony swallowed hard. The employees watched in stunned silence. The reporter's microphone was right there. Tony's chest rose and fell rapidly. His arrogance, gone. His control, destroyed. Shaq finally let go, pushing him back slightly. Tony stumbled, catching himself against the counter. Shaq crossed his arms. I are done here." Tony's mouth opened, but no words came out. Then the shop door swung open, and the real owner stepped inside. Tony's breath was ragged, his chest rising and falling as the weight of the moment settled in. He wasn't just losing the argument, he was losing everything. His business, his power, his reputation. And Shaq? He stood there calm as ever, arms crossed, towering over him like a living reminder of Tony's downfall. Tony slammed his fists on the counter, rattling the register. "This is a joke. You can't just walk in here and—" Shaq didn't even flinch. "Not a joke," he said, his voice steady. "Just business." Tony's eyes darted to the employees behind the counter, the ones who had been too scared to speak up before. Now, some were smirking, others looked relieved. That was when the shop's real owner stepped forward. "Tony," the older man said, his voice tired but firm, We need to talk. Tony whirled around, his face twisted with desperation. You're really doing this? Tony snapped. You're selling the shop to him? The owner sighed. You've been overcharging customers for years. You lied, you scammed hardworking people, and I let it slide too long. He shook his head. But this is the last straw. Tony's hands clenched into fists. He looked wild, like a man drowning, grasping at anything to stay afloat. Shaq leaned against the counter, watching the meltdown. You heard him, Tony. You're out. Tony laughed bitterly. Oh, so that's it? I'm just supposed to walk away? Just like that? Shaq shrugged. You could do that. Or, he let the word hang, you could embarrass yourself even more. Your call. Tony's nostrils flared, his shoulders tensed. And then, his hand shot under the counter. Shaq's eyes locked onto him. What was he reaching for? Tony's fingers tightened around the cold steel of the wrench beneath the counter. His breath came in short, ragged bursts. His world was collapsing around him. His business, his reputation, his power. And standing in the middle of the wreckage was Shaq, calm, unshaken, watching him like a man who had seen this kind of desperation before. The shop was dead silent. The air, thick with the smell of oil and metal, carried an unspoken warning. The employees froze in place. The dad in the corner clutched his son's hand, his body half turned toward the door. Even the news crew, their cameras still rolling, waited. Then, a flicker of movement. Tony's hand shot up from under the counter, a heavy wrench clenched tight in his grip. The moment stretched, unbearable. The cold steel gleamed under the fluorescent lights. Shaq didn't move. His voice was steady, almost eerily calm. You really want to do this? Tony's jaw clenched. His eyes were wild, desperate. You ruined my life, man. Shaq took a single step forward, towering, unshaken, unbreakable. No, he said, voice like a hammer, striking steel. You did that yourself. For the first time, Tony hesitated. The grip on the wrench slackened, just slightly. The employees shifted uneasily. The dad pulled his son closer. The air in the shop felt thick, heavy. Shaq's gaze never wavered. You scammed hard-working people for years. You took advantage of folks who didn't have a choice. He gestured to the dad, to the other customers, to the employees who stood frozen, waiting. Now, when you're finally facing consequences, you think picking up a weapon is going to fix it? Tony's nostrils flared. His fingers flexed around the wrench. Shaq took another step forward, close enough that the difference in their size was undeniable. Put it down. The words came low, controlled. Not a threat, a command. For a moment, it seemed like Tony might swing. But then, his eyes darted to the cameras. The news crew's red light was blinking. The whole town was watching. Maybe the whole world. Tony's breath hitched. The weight of his choices finally caught up to him. His grip loosened. And with a sharp, shuddering exhale, he let go. The wrench hit the ground with a metallic clang. Silence. Then, sirens wailed outside. Red and blue lights flashed through the windows. The police had arrived. The shop door swung open with force, and two uniformed officers stepped inside. The moment they entered, the tension in the air thickened. Their eyes scanned the room, lingering on the employees frozen in place. The news crew still recording, the customers watching with bated breath. One officer, a grizzled man with salt and pepper hair, took the lead. His voice was sharp, authoritative. What's going on here? Shaq didn't hesitate. He took a step back, tilting his head toward Tony. Ask him. Tony's shoulders tensed. The weight of the moment, the reality of his downfall was finally sinking in. His face, once smug and arrogant, was now blank, but his clenched fist told a different story. The shop owner, an older man in a crisp button-up, the real owner of Grayson Auto Repair, stepped forward. His voice was clear, steady. These guys caught Tony running a scam, overcharging customers, lying about repairs, taking advantage of people who couldn't afford it. He crossed his arms. And now, it's all on camera. The officer turned back to Tony, expression unreadable. Is that true? For the first time since the whole ordeal began, Tony didn't argue. He didn't try to deny it, didn't try to spin a lie. He just stood there, silent. The second officer pulled out a pair of handcuffs, stepping closer. Tony Grayson, you're under investigation for fraudulent business practices. That's when Tony snapped back to life. Wait, hold on, he stammered. Look, I just... The officer grabbed his arm, turning him toward the door. You can explain it to the investigators. The news crew zoomed in, capturing every second. Tony gritted his teeth as he was led past Shaq. His eyes burned with resentment. You think you won, big guy? His voice was low, laced with venom. Shaq stayed calm. Nah, I didn't win. The people you scammed did. Outside, a small crowd had gathered. Customers, former employees, people who had been wronged. The moment Tony stepped out in cuffs, a murmur ran through them. Then, applause. A few people even cheered. Tony's face burned red. Humiliated, defeated, exposed. The dad, still standing near the counter, let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. He ran a hand through his hair, looking over at Shaq. Finally, Shaq clapped a hand on his shoulder. Next time, he said, his voice low but firm, don't let anyone treat you like that. The dad nodded, but then a voice cut through the room. One of the mechanics, a younger guy in an oil-stained uniform, cleared his throat. So, he shifted awkwardly, looking around. Who's our boss now? Every employee in the shop turned to Shaq, waiting for an answer. The shop was silent for a moment, the weight of the last few minutes sinking in. Tony was gone, let out in cuffs. The cameras had caught everything. The customers who had once been scammed now stood outside, watching justice unfold. And inside, the employees, those who had spent years under Tony's thumb, stood waiting. Shaq rolled his shoulders and turned to them. Y'all still want to work here? A murmur spread through the room. The mechanics exchanged glances, uncertain. A young guy, no older than 20, wiped grease off his hands onto his coveralls. If you're really taking over, does that mean things are going to change? His voice held a mix of hope and doubt. Shaq smirked. Oh yeah, big time. He stepped forward, running a hand along the scratched-up counter, then looking around at the shop. First order of business? No more scams. No more overcharging desperate people just to make an extra buck. The employees straightened at that. A woman near the back, her hair tied up in a bandana, crossed her arms. So, no lying to customers anymore? Shaq shook his head. Nope. We fix what needs fixing, and we charge fair prices. Simple as that. A few heads nodded in approval. Shaq wasn't done. He pointed at the group. And second, y'all start getting paid what you deserve. The employees' eyes widened. One man, an older mechanic with oil-stained hands, frowned. Wait, you mean actual wages? Not Tony's under-the-table nonsense? Shaq nodded. That's right, real wages, real benefits, paid time off, health insurance. A hush fell over the shop. Then, cheers. A few mechanics actually clapped. The tension that had hung in the air was gone. The place already felt different, lighter. The dad, who had been at the center of this whole thing, stepped forward, his son gripping his hand. He looked at Shaq, eyes full of gratitude. So, what's next? Shaq paused, letting the moment settle. Then he turned his gaze toward the open shop doors. The news cameras were still rolling. The whole town was watching. He grinned. I think we can do something even bigger. The employees and customers leaned in, waiting to hear what Shaq had planned next. The news spread like wildfire. By nightfall, headlines flashed across TV screens and social media feeds. NBA legend Shaquille O'Neal exposes corrupt mechanic. Buys the shop to fix it. Clips of Tony being led away in cuffs played on repeat. People shared Shaq's speech about fairness and integrity, praising him for standing up for the everyday customer. Within hours, the shop's online reviews flipped overnight. Where there had once been warnings about scams, now there were hopeful comments. Finally, someone who actually cares. I'm bringing my car in tomorrow. Shaq just did what the whole town has been wanting for years. And the next morning, the results were instant. When Shaq pulled into the lot, he wasn't met with an empty parking space. Instead, a line of cars stretched around the block. Customers, curious onlookers, and even former victims of Tony's scams crowded the entrance, waiting for the doors to open. Shaq stepped out of his car, looking over the crowd. A few people waved. Some held up their phones recording. He chuckled. Y'all here for an oil change? Or just to take pictures? Laughter rippled through the crowd. But one man stepped forward. The same struggling dad from the day before. His son stood beside him, gripping a small brown bag. Shaq, the dad said, shaking his head in disbelief. I don't know how to thank you, man. Shaq grinned, slapping a hand on his shoulder. You already did, by bringing that car back for an actual repair. The dad hesitated. I don't have much money yet, but I wanted to. Shaq held up a hand. Nah, this one's on the house. The dad blinked. Wait, seriously? Shaq nodded. But next time? He nodded toward the brown bag in the kid's hand. Just bring me a burger. The kid giggled, holding up the bag proudly. We already did! Shaq took it with a laugh. Now that's good business. The employees, now standing at the entrance, watched the exchange with grins on their faces. The same shop that had once been a place of fear and scams was now filled with laughter, relief, and trust. Tony had spent years taking advantage of hardworking people. Now, he was gone, and in his place, Shaq had built something real,